on Jerusalem Dateline. This week on Jerusalem Dateline, President Trump decides not to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, at least for now. Plus, CBN's Scott Ross revisits one of the most important battlefields of the Six-Day War.
I don't want to get overly dramatic, how can you? But this is hallowed ground.
And a look at the oldest piece of paper with the word Jerusalem on it.
This particular papyrus is actually a miracle.
All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. We're coming to you this week from just outside the walls of the Old City, and I'm joined by CBN correspondent Julie Stahl to talk about some of the latest developments here in Israel and the Middle East. Julie, the biggest one has to be the fact that U.S. President Trump has gone ahead and signed the waiver not to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. What's the reaction here in Israel?
That's right, Chris. I think it's disappointment maybe, but not so much surprise. We've been going on this track for months. It's been in the press. Everybody's been talking, will he move it, won't he move it? And now we've decided he's not moving it for now. You know, the Prime Minister emphasized the strong U.S.-Israel relations. Of course, he said he's doing it because of the peace process. He wants to give a chance to promote the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Israeli leaders don't believe that's going to work. They say that it's actually going to do more harm than good.
And speaking of the peace process, one news that came out this week was the fact that President Trump apparently yelled at Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas for lying to him at the White House.
That's right. Mahmoud Abbas, you know, he told President Trump at the White House that he was for peace and everything. They were educating their children for peace, and obviously that they're not. So initially, after the meeting, when he was in Bethlehem, President Trump, everything was, oh, this is fine, we had a good meeting. Now it's just coming out that it wasn't such a great meeting after all.
Yeah, that's right. He yelled at him and he said, I can't think of another time when a U.S. president has ever been reported actually yelling at somebody like Mahmoud Abbas.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing that's happened this week is Danny Danon, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, was voted the vice president of the General Assembly. I don't think that's ever happened before.
I don't think so either. Usually Israel is there, but a bit persona non grata. Usually doesn't have a position there. So it's going to be kind of an interesting change there. We're kind of wondering if it has anything to do with Nikki Haley being now the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations.
Certainly is a change of tone there.
Definitely.
In the United Nations. And one other thing, Julie, that's happened here in the Middle East, maybe a sign of the things going on. Wonder Woman, it's premiering this week around the world, but Lebanon is not going to show it. And tell us why. That's
because the Wonder Woman is actually an Israeli actress, Gal Gadot. She served in the Israeli army, and Lebanon doesn't want her in their theaters. So, yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. You can see the struggle going on in the world right now.
Yeah, whether it's politics or culture,
absolutely.
The war goes on.
That's absolutely true.
Well, Julie, thanks for your expertise and insight into what's happening here in the Middle East.
It's good to share, Chris.
Well, as a follow-up to what we reported last week, 30 Egyptians were murdered simply because they were Christians. Survivors of the attack said 10 masked militants forced victims to leave the bus one by one and then asked them if they were Christian before killing them. As each person left the bus, they were asked to renounce their Christian faith and convert to Islam. A chaplain comforting the survivors said all of them refused. Each person was killed with a gunshot to the head or throat, including children. Over the weekend, ISIS claimed responsibility for the killings. In yet another terrorist attack here in the Middle East, about 90 people were killed in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. A massive bomb was hidden in a sewage tanker truck near the Afghan presidential palace and detonated during rush hour in a highly secure diplomatic area in Kabul, just about 1,200 feet from the German embassy. In addition to the dozens of people who were killed, around 400 more are seriously hurt. Most of the victims are civilians, including women and children. No one has immediately claimed responsibility for the bombing, and it's one of the worst attacks the city has ever seen. The Kabul bombing came at the beginning of the Muslim month of Ramadan. CBN's George Thomas talked with two Islamic experts as to why there's usually an increase of terror attacks during this month.
Muslims around the world are praying and fasting this month in observance of Ramadan. It started on May 26th and ends on June 24th. While the vast majority of Muslims use the time for prayer and atonement, a growing number are resorting to violence. To understand why Ramadan is so important to Islamic jihadists, I'm joined by Robert Spencer, author of several books on Islam, including The Complete Infidel's Guide to the Quran, and Ishik Abla, a former radical Muslim who at the age of 12 wanted to become a suicide bomber. Now she's a Christian and runs Ishik Abla Ministries. Thanks for coming on the show, everyone. Ishik, let me start with you. Why is this month holy to Muslims around the world, and what do they hope to achieve?
George, it is so important to Muslims because it is ordered in the Quran by Allah to fast for a month, and also it's a sacrifice for them, sacrificial of their flesh, putting their flesh into suffering for Allah.
Robert, let me go to you. But Ramadan is also a time of jihad and martyrdom for Muslims, right?
Yes, that's right, George. We have to remember that jihad means struggle. And so the spiritual struggle within the soul to grow closer to Allah and to become more righteous is the same jihad as the struggle against unbelievers, because Allah commands warfare against unbelievers in the Quran itself. And so Ramadan is quintessentially the month of jihad.
Is this why you are seeing these spectacular attacks happen during Ramadan? For example, the massacre of Christians in the Sinai Desert a few days ago, the huge truck bombing in Kabul, Afghanistan, and then in Baghdad. Are we going to see more and more of these spectacular attacks happen in the next days to come?
Yes, George, I think that's virtually assured because of the nature of Islamic belief regarding jihad and Ramadan and the fact that it is a spiritual devotion. The Quran says fighting is prescribed for you even though you dislike it. And Ramadan is all about doing the things that Allah wants you to do that you might dislike, and fighting being foremost among them. We're going to see more terrorism during Ramadan.
Coming up, a look at one of the most strategic battles in Israel's modern history.
Whoever sits on the Golan Heights totally dominates this whole region.
Near the end of the 1967 Six-Day War, attention shifted from Jerusalem here to about 120 miles north. Israeli troops took control of the Golan Heights. And as we'll show you, for the last 50 years, that battle has turned out to be one of the most strategic of the war.
Whoever sits on the Golan Heights totally dominates this whole region.
That's in part because of the proximity to the Sea of Galilee. The Golan Heights shares borders with Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and Damascus is only 40 miles away. For decades, Syria controlled the Golan Heights. Here on the high ground overlooking the Sea of Galilee, Syrian artillery and snipers shot and shelled Israelis below. Children grew up running to bomb shelters, and residents lived under the constant threat of attack.
So all along the line of this cliff were Syrian bunkers and military posts and cannons and artilleries. The communities beneath the Golan Heights were totally at the mercies of the Syrians.
Overlooking the Sea of Galilee, Middle East expert Avi Melamed told me why this ground is so important.
Now, you have to remember, the Sea of Galilee is the biggest fresh water body in Israel, providing something like 25–30% of the water consumption or the fresh water consumption in Israel. In 1948 until 1967, what happened was that the Syrians occupied some strategic areas. The major result of that was an enormously increasing pressure on Israel, mostly in the context of the water and the use of water.
Israel faced a literal uphill battle against the Syrian army, a rocky slope that rose 1,700 feet from the Sea of Galilee. Israel captured the Golan Plateau during the last 2 days of the Six-Day War.
We were afraid that Syria will come back. And again, they will shell the valley and try to take the water, to take the Jordan. We decided to make the first kibbutz in the Golan Heights.
And just a month after the war, Yehuda Harel and his family joined the first Israelis moving here.
We got a permission from the army to get inside the Golan Heights because it was a military area. And we got a job from them to collect cows that were wild in the area.
They first lived in what had been housing for Syrian army officers.
We are very near to Quneitra, about 100 meters from Quneitra, and we are near to the quarter that we used to live here for almost 5 years. This was the house that we, with another 3 families, lived in this house.
Eventually, the community moved across the ridge and still farms near the border. Today, close to 50,000 people, more than 25,000 Israelis, and about 22,000 Druze live on the Golan Heights. It's known for its fresh fruit, like the grapes used in award-winning Israeli wines.
In the last more than 40 years, the Golan Heights is the most quiet area of Israel. Everything happened in the other side of the border.
But that could be changing.
Do you see any similarities between the conditions prior to 1967 and the conditions now?
I would say that the strategic threat, as far as Israel is concerned, is today much more severe in comparison to the pre-1967. The major reason for that is that the presence of Iranians and Iranian-backed Shiite militias stone's throw away from the Israeli-Syrian ceasefire line.
Melamed said Iran wants to establish a new front here, similar to those established in South Lebanon and the Gaza Strip.
Trying to launch a military front against Israel in the Golan Heights could result in a massive eruption, because Israel will not stand for that, and rightly so.
On the 49th anniversary of the Six-Day War, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made it very clear how Israel views the Golan Heights.
They are for peace. In the stormy region around us, Israel is the stabilizing factor. Israel is the solution, not the problem. The Golan Heights will forever remain in Israel's hands. Israel will never come down from the Golan Heights.
For now, Harel says there's a reason why this area has remained quiet.
We live in peace. It's a peace because we are in the Golan Heights. When we were only in the valley and the enemy was up on the hill, it was not peace. To live in peace, you have to be strong and to live in the higher place.
Coming up, why paratroopers were ready to face death in the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War played a pivotal role in the development of the Israel Defense Forces. One of the first urban battles took place here in Jerusalem and set the stage for future battles. CBN's Scott Ross talked with an IDF commander about the impact still felt 50 years later.
The 55th Paratroopers Brigade still serves as a reserve unit today, as it did in the 1967 battle for Jerusalem.
We're part of the 98th Division, which is more or less the equivalent of the 101st Airborne Division in the U.S. Army.
Lieutenant Colonel Anshel Pfeffer commands the 28th Reserve Battalion of the 55th Brigade.
We do the most interesting and most dangerous and most challenging missions in the IDF, so I believe. And as paratroopers, we live up to our code, walking on our feet in the night quietly and hitting the enemy wherever he is without him knowing about us in advance.
Pfeffer, a high-tech executive, took me through the trenches at Ammunition Hill, where battalion soldiers fought for Jerusalem 50 years ago.
Well, Ammunition Hill was the bunker of the Jordanian police academy, which is just behind us. And the police academy was the main objective of that specific battle before they continued towards the old city.
And this was, what, day 2 of a 6-day war?
Day 2. After taking the police academy, they advanced towards, it's called today the Ammunition Hill, and they spent many, many hours trying to advance from trench to trench.
How many men were here fighting?
They began almost 200, and very, very few remained standing at the end of the battle.
My. But they weren't trained for this kind of warfare, were they?
They were very surprised. They described it as a very big disappointment not being parachuted to fight the Egyptians, but then, of course, it became one of the most important battles in Israeli history. The battle specifically here, but also in other places in Jerusalem, was all done in very improvised Israeli-type warfare.
It's hard to understand how men with equipment on their backs, I assume, rifles, grenades, whatever other equipment they had, how did they make it through these narrow trenches to take the enemy on, to encounter them?
It's a very good question. Unfortunately, many of them had to climb above, and the stories describe young soldiers telling their commanders, I'm going to go up with my machine gun, and as you're walking down in the trench, I'll go on top. And every time they advanced 1, 2, 3, 5 feet, and then the next guy climbed up and continued it. The previous one was hit, and that's how they managed to advance. Some of them pulled back the injured towards the injured facility with the doctors behind, but they had to keep advancing.
I can stand here as an American and look at our history and talk about Revolutionary War, Civil War. That's hundreds of years ago.
Right.
This is 50 years ago.
Indeed.
You know, I don't want to get overly dramatic. How can you? But this is hallowed ground. Do you see it that way?
Yes, yes, it is. This ground is holy ground as far as the way we see it, because our friends, our comrades fell here. It's a place we respect very much. As you can see, it became a national monument museum.
Standing by the half-track that barreled through Lion's Gate into the old city, Pfeffer told me of their honor in continuing the heritage of those who have gone before them. Have you talked to any of the men who fought and some of your fathers, grandfathers, and talk to them about their emotion of that moment?
Yeah, it's important to mention. We, every year on the Six-Day War Commemoration Day, we meet with our predecessors. We also remember the fallen, and we talk to them. It's a very strong part of our heritage.
What motivated these men?
At the end of the day, it's fighting with your friends, with your comrades, what they call brothers in arms, and that's what makes people, at the end of the day, rise up towards enemy fire and advance. The big vision, the mission, conquering Jerusalem, all that, it's important, but at the end of the moment when you rise up towards the fire, it's for your friends.
Are you men motivated like that today?
We believe so. We look up to them. Today's young soldiers are as, both in their professionalism and also in their values, are as good as we were then.
Pfeffer, who commands about 700 reserves, told me how important the lessons of that war are to soldiers today. How has the past affected the future, the training of the men now?
The battle for Jerusalem in 1967 was one of the first battles in urban warfare. And if you look around today, both in the IDF and also the U.S. Army and any other Western army, the challenge of fighting terrorists and other organizations which are fighting from within civilian and urban warfare environments has become the most common part of warfare, and we're learning.
But even today, you're surrounded by people that want to destroy you, that want to annihilate you, wipe you off the map, drive you into the sea. Your existence is questioned. So do you live in a defensive posture, or do people live in fear?
Well, I'm a reserve soldier.
Right.
80% of my time I'm with my family, at my work, enjoying life, having a great time. And I think most of Israelis live a peaceful, very happy, I'd say Western-like lifestyle. Every couple of years, we have a few weeks of tension, and they know we're here to defend them. And now it's our turn.
Scott Ross for CBN News at Ammunition Hill in Jerusalem.
Up next, it's just a small piece of paper, but tells a big story. Recently, on the same day the UN agency UNESCO basically denied any Jewish connection to the Temple Mount, a newly discovered piece of history links the Jewish people to Jerusalem as far back as 2,700 years ago. Here's a story about an ancient piece of paper and the history it uncovers. The small papyrus document contains the earliest mention of Jerusalem ever found outside of the Bible.
Prior to this, there were only 2 other papyrus written in Hebrew found from this period at all. And perhaps the greater significance is that for the first time we have in Hebrew the name Jerusalem.
Both the style of the script and the carbon-14 analysis dated the artifact back to the first Jewish temple period in the 7th century BC. It says, from the king's maidservant, from Na'arat, jars of wine, to Jerusalem.
The document is a shipment certificate from a place called Na'aran. We mention that 2 jars of wine are going to be shipped from Na'aran to Jerusalem.
A unit from the Israel Antiquities Authority seized the fragment from Palestinian looters excavating without a license.
We understood that we have something very, very important in our hand. We read it and we understood its value.
Eitan Klein said they had taken it from the same area where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found decades ago.
Until today, only in the Judean desert have scrolls been found, because the conditions in the Judean desert are probably the best for this organic material.
Curator Penina Shore says it's not that other writings didn't exist, but these survived because of the dry climate.
This particular papyrus is actually a miracle, because here we're talking about a papyrus from First Temple times.
Scroll researcher Oren Abelman says the Jewish connection to Jerusalem is clear.
This is a period that we know from various historical accounts, both from the Bible and from external sources, that there was the kingdom of Judea at this period.
In addition to the Jerusalem connection, Shore says if the reading is correct, there's also a new understanding of the role of women.
And if it's Amat HaMelech, that's the slave, the woman officer or slave of the king. So not only are we talking about Jerusalem, we're also talking about women who are in high office.
As for the UNESCO vote, experts agreed it wasn't based on facts.
It's a political decision. It has nothing to do with reality.
It has no meaning whatsoever for archaeologists or historians.
I'm an archaeologist. I just explained in length all the reasons why this papyrus is so very important, and why it is dated to the First Temple times.
Abelman said it's not only an important find for Jewish history, but also for development of the world. Well, those kind of discoveries continue to link the Jewish people to the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. Well, that's it for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline. On Jerusalem Dateline.